¿Se oye? Okay.
Okay, so let's start with the session of the defense of the master thesis, Modeling Preferences in Language Contact by Pablo Rosillo. Pablo, you have around 20 minutes, okay? Later there will be the questions of the jury.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming. I will present you my thesis, which is, as Jose said, Modeling Preferences in Language Contact, and it has been carried out under the supervision of David Sanchez and Maxi San Miguel. So you all know that since the publication in 2003 of the pioneering work on language competition by Abrams and Strogatz, later research has been developed in order to try to understand the forces that could be leading to the extinction, dominance, or coexistence between languages. And this research is based on sociological factors such as the prestige of the languages, the intersimilarity between them, or the difficulty to learn them. But I am sure all of you have been eventually witnesses of how whenever a language is present in a society, it subdivides into different varieties or dialects. For example, here with the Catalan. Valencian, Catalan, and Balearic people use the language in different ways. They use different words and they use them in different ways. When this happens in a language, this language undergoes what is called a standardization process, in which appointed institutions create a list of lexicon and rules of use of the language, which constitute the standard variety. This standard variety is often seen by the population as a variety of prestige, authority, correctness, and social assent. But some communities of speakers may prefer to use the language in other ways. And these ways constitute the vernacular varieties, for example, in the Balearic Islands, in the Valencian community, or the famous case of the African-American English. An example of this interaction between the preferences and the use of the vernacular variety are the conclusions of this study carried out in Andalusia, in which they find how Andalusian students disengage the use of the vernacular variety from social assent or professional perspectives while keeping favorable judgments towards the people who use it. So these sociological factors are the main motivation that took us to propose a model of variety competition implementing the use of preferences of the speakers. It is important to notice, first of all, that the aforementioned sociological factors are not exclusive of varieties. They often happen also in entire language dynamics. But because of our motivation, we are going to refer to varieties of the same language. All our variables will refer to varieties of the same language, bearing into mind that the same conclusions may be drawn from a language competition framework. So we propose the following model in which in our society there exist 4 groups. The capital letter refers to the variety used by the speakers, that may be the standard or the vernacular one, and the subindex to the preference they have either for the standard or the vernacular. For example, in this group, people speak the standard variety while prefer the standard variety, but in this group, people speak the standard variety while prefer the vernacular variety. And we will consider changes between groups, changes of variety or changes of preference, but we won't consider a simultaneous change of variety and preference, because we propose that either you change the preference, the variety you use, and then you change of preference, or a change of your preference has as a consequence a change of variety, but not the two of them simultaneously. So we will propose some transition rates with which we will construct the mean field approximation of an agent-based model, and we will analyze the dynamical equations. So as I told you, there are 2 kinds of changes, the change of variety or the change of preferences. Let's analyze first the change of variety, the variety changing transitions. In this sense, we propose the following transitions, and these lowercase variables refer to proportion of speakers, meaning, for example, that x sub 2 is the fraction of all of the speakers that speak the standard variety while keeping a preference for the vernacular one. In this sense, for example, the transition rate from speaking the vernacular and preferring the standard to speaking the standard and preferring the standard depends in the total fraction of speakers of the standard variety. These transition rates happen in virtue of the prestige parameters, S1 and S2. They have to be understood as the Abrams and Strogatz prestige, but we have 2 kinds of prestiges. S1 would be the prestige of the standard variety from the point of view of the vernacular speakers who prefer the standard, and S2 the prestige of the vernacular variety from the point of view on the standard speakers who prefer the vernacular. To model this situation that I mentioned before, this is that the standard variety always has a higher prestige than the vernacular variety. We fix S1 higher than S2, and we call this fixed prestige hierarchy. Also, to prevent situations in which the rate to change to the variety you don't prefer is higher than the rate to change to the variety that you do prefer, we set S1 and S2 between 1/2 and 1. And the same happens with the change of preference. We have four transition rates, the preference change in transitions, but in this case, they happen in virtue of the total fraction of speakers which have a certain preference. For example, to change from speaking vernacular and preferring a standard to speaking vernacular and preferring vernacular, a change of preference to prefer vernacular depends on the total fraction of people who actually prefers the vernacular, because we propose that these changes are motivated by the social pressure exerted by the people with certain preference. And this transition rate depends on two parameters, what we call the social pressure parameters, and they modulate the rates at which speakers change the preference towards the vernacular variety. C1 for the vernacular speakers and C2 for the standard speakers. And they are in principle defined between 0 and 1. So we analyze the model, but making first a change of variables for an easier analysis to understand the results, and also envisaging a future fit to available data on variety use. In this case, capital X and capital Y are obviously variables referring to the total fraction of standard variety speakers and the total fraction of vernacular variety speakers. And we create another two variables, omega and Z, which are differences between people who prefer the standard minus people who prefer the vernacular, or people who prefer the vernacular minus people who prefer the standard in the vernacular variety case. As our society is isolated, we have a first restriction, which is X plus Y equals to 1. The analysis of this model yields analytical equations which are quite complicated. So we propose first to analyze two simplified versions of the model. We will go into detail later, but as a first glance, we will fix the amount of people with certain preference, and then we will analyze how this preference affects the dynamics of the variety use. And then we will do the contrary. We will fix the amount of people who speaks each of the varieties, and we will see how this fixation affects the dynamics of the preferences. We will start with the first simplification. So let's talk about a very nice example, which is Els altres catalans, a book published in 1964 by Francesc Candel. This book responds to a situation in Catalonia in the second half of the 20th century, in which the city of Barcelona was receiving a huge flow of immigration from other Spanish-speaking communities of Spain. So what we will find there is a situation of mixing between Catalan people and foreigners who would adapt to the Catalan language while keeping their preference to Spanish. So continuing with the model, what we do is ban the changes of preference. We only allow for changes in varieties, and we then will have only three parameters: the prestige parameters S1 and S2, and the preference parameter, which is X1 plus I sub 1, referring to the total fraction of speakers with preference for the standard variety. So what we will study is how this preference affects the dynamics of the variety use. But first, before continuing with the analysis, I must present you a disclaimer. If in this simplified model we fix S1 equals to 1 minus X2, we recover the Abrams and Strogatz situation. In fact, the dynamical equation referring to the proportion of speakers of the standard variety is the same as in the Abrams and Strogatz model. In addition, Masuda and his colleagues proposed in 2011 an extension of the partisan voter model, which was also proposed by Masuda and his colleagues. And if we do this change, this relation of parameters, we recover that model. But this is not a problem. Why? Because we cannot make this relation between parameters, as we have already fixed S1 always higher than S2, and S1 and S2 between 1/2 and 1. So we cannot recover this. This is not a problem. Also, we have omega and Z, which are variables accounting for the dynamics in preferences, and they don't disappear. So this simplification is different from the Abrams and Strogatz model. When it comes to Masuda model, well, they focus on voter model dynamics. We focus more on the use of the varieties. They focus on consensus, and we take our analysis beyond of what they did. So this is not a problem. Now let's continue with analysis of our first simplified model. We find 3 fixed points. The first of them implies the extinction of the standard variety, the second, the extinction of the vernacular variety, and the third allows for coexistence. Making a linear stability analysis, we have numerically found that there always exists one and only one stable fixed point for any value of S1, S2, and alpha, the prestige parameters and the preference. So what we try to do is to understand the relationship between the value of this unique stable fixed point and the preference, which is our main implementation. And we do that by plotting these figures. In the first row, we plot the value of x, and in the second row of omega of the unique stable fixed point in a color scale in terms of all possible value of the prestige parameters S1 and S2 and for 5 chosen values of alpha. If alpha equals 0, no one prefers the standard variety, and we find that all stable situations lead to the extinction of the standard variety. This is remarkable because although the standard variety always has a higher prestige than the vernacular one, the fact that anyone prefers it leads to its extinction. When alpha equals 1, everyone prefers the standard variety, so all the stable situations imply the dominance of the standard variety. But what is more interesting is alpha between 0 and 1. For example, in alpha equals 0.25, we find 3 different phases. The first one is the situation in which the standard variety gets extinct, the second one in which the standard variety dominates, and then we have here one in the middle which allows for coexistence. And we see that its shape and its size changes depending on the value of alpha. So our question is, how does this coexistent area change with alpha? How does its size change? And that's what we were able to compute analytically. That's what we show here. Here, to understand the plot, what we do is to plot the fraction of all the stable fixed points, which imply either coexistence in the blue curve, depending on alpha, extinction of the standard variety in red, or extinction of the vernacular variety. So what we would expect is that the maximum of the coexistence curve is in alpha equals 0.5, because in that situation, half of the population prefers the standard variety and the other half the vernacular variety. So there isn't any variety preferred more than the other one, so that should allow for more coexistence than other configurations. But that's not what we find. We find that the maximum is before alpha equals 0.5. And this is due to the fixed prestige hierarchy, because the preferences act as a counterforce to the fact that the prestige of the standard is always higher than the prestige of the vernacular. So in this sense, there is the situation in which there are more people preferring the vernacular in which the maximum of coexistence occurs. Another remarkable fact is that when alpha is higher than 0.5, there isn't any situation in which the standard variety gets extinct. But we don't find this situation in the vernacular variety curve. There are always situations in which the vernacular variety gets extinct. And this is also due to the fact that the prestige of the standard is always higher than the vernacular. Okay, this is one of the main results, the first cause-effect relation we have seen between the preferences and the fixed prestige hierarchy. And now let's analyze the second simplification of the model, in which we don't allow for changes in variety. We only allow for changes in preference. A good example in linguistic terms of this model is Belgium. In northern part of Belgium, only Flemish is official and spoken, which is a Belgian variety of Dutch. In the southern part of Belgium, we have Walloon, which is the only official and spoken language, which is a Belgian variety of French. And then in the east, around 1% of the population, German. And in Brussels, the 2 of them are official. So how does this model work? In this model, we only allow for changes in preference. So we again have 3 parameters: the social pressure parameters we presented before, and the fixed fraction of speakers of the standard variety. Before we fixed the amount of people who preferred certain variety, now what we fix is the amount of people who speaks certain variety, and let's see what happens with the preferences. We continue as we did with the first simplification of the model, and we find 3 fixed points. To categorize them, we define consensus. Our definition of consensus means that every speaker in the society prefers the same variety. So the first fixed point accounts for consensus for vernacular. If this situation is fulfilled, any speaker in the society will prefer vernacular. The same happens here for standard. And this third fixed point doesn't allow for consensus, at least, under our definition, which is obviously different from that used by Botter model-like studies. So we proceed in the same way as with the first simplification, because we know there is only one and always one stable fixed point for each value of C1, C2, and the proportion of speakers of the standard variety. And we find this. Here we again plot the proportion of a stable fixed point with certain characteristics in terms of the fraction of speakers. What we see is that the closer we get to x0 equals 0.5, this is the closer we get to the situation in which half of the population speak one variety and half of the population speak the other, like the highest mixture linguistically of the population, then consensus happens less often in all the possible stable fixed points. The situation is not as noticeable as with the fixed preferences model, but we see that difference. So doing this analysis, we have a hint on how to proceed with the general model. Now we will allow for changes in preference and in variety, and we will do the same. We will compute numerically all the stable fixed points, and we will compute the fraction of those stable fixed points which imply coexistence of the two varieties on the left or extinction of the standard in the right. So here we have 4 situations which I will describe briefly. First, if both C1 and C2 are lower than 1/2, what does this mean? This means that both standard speakers and vernacular speakers prefer the standard variant. In this sense, what we find is that no coexistence is allowed and no extinction of the standard is allowed. All the stable fixed points, all the stable fixed points, imply the dominance of the standard variety. On the contrary, if both C1 and C2 are higher than 0.5, what we find is that all the stable fixed points imply the extinction of the standard variety because everyone prefers the vernacular. But if they are different, for example, if C1 is lower than 1/2 and C2 is higher than 1/2, what we have is that the vernacular speakers prefer the standard and the standard speakers prefer the vernacular. So we have kind of a cycle which allows for coexistence in all cases. In all the stable fixed points, we find coexistence. If we do the contrary situation in which all the standard speakers prefer the standard and all the vernacular speakers prefer the vernacular, what we find is that almost 50% of the situations imply the extinction of the standard and more than 50% of the situations imply the extinction of the vernacular. No coexistence is allowed, and this difference in proportion is due to the fixed prestige hierarchy. And just to finish, and as out of curiosity, as a first step of looking for local effects in complex networks, we created some agent-based models and we ran them in several networks with different topologies and sizes. These results are for the first simplification of the model, the one in which we fixed the amount of people with certain preference. And we find that at 2000 Monte Carlo steps, the different networks reproduce qualitatively the results that we got in the mean field approximation. This is the coexistence diagrams I presented you before. And what we found is that there are 2 absorbing states, the one implying the extinction of the standard and the one implying the extinction of the vernacular. So we expect that after a sufficient amount of time, one of those 2 absorbing states will be reached and no coexistence will be allowed in the infinite size networks. I have here an example. In a small network, we have in black the result of the mean field approximation, and in blue and red we have trajectories in the network of one is Barabasi-Albert and the other one is Erdos-Rengi with all-to-one connections, and they eventually reach one of the absorbing states. We did the same for the second simplification of the model, and here we find some curiosities, like for example, the Barabasi-Albert didn't reach in any case this zone here, which implies consensus for standard variety, and any network reached this zone here, which implies consensus for the vernacular variety. And this is included in further work we should study in complex networks. So to sum up, what I have learned doing this work is that Creating a minimal model allows us to look for cause-effect relations, because we have studied how, even though a prestige hierarchy exists, by implementing preferences, we can act as a counterforce and allow for coexistence or even the extinction of the most prestigious variety. Also, in the second simplification of the model, what we saw is that mixing the population in linguistic terms makes consensus more difficult to achieve. Finite size effects were very interesting because, in principle, in the two simplification of the model, coexistence or non-consensus are not allowed in finite size networks. And it would be interesting to work further on networks to develop a proper agent-based model for the general model, to run it in networks to see if there are any circumstances allowing for coexistence. Maybe implement coevolution of networks, because it is a more realistic situation that the topology of the network changes over time. And also, it would be interesting to think how to fit this model to available data to test its reliability. But we find ourselves with a very high handicap, and this is how to infer the preference of the speaker from samples retrieved from Twitter or written samples or something like that. So all in all, my supervisors and I have met, designed a model, then met again, then redesigned the model, then we met again, then designed the model again, and then finally we came with a very simple model to implement preferences in variety competition, and it has been amazing. Muchas gracias.
Okay, so thanks, Pablo. So we will start with the questions, but I think first it will be good to stop the at least the recording.